Hello, today we'll be presenting on the topic of building, populating, and SDVing a RAVE EDC study in 10 weeks. My name is Reyes Osuna. I'm Associate Director of Clinical Data Management at Chimerix. I work closely on this project with my fellow presenter, Agbesi Blakpour, who is the Director of Programming and Business Operations at Amencefs. Chimerix is a biopharmaceutical company which engages in the research, development, and commercialization of pharmaceutical products. We specialize in the areas of oncology and virology. Amencefs is a pharmaceutical services provider focusing on EDC programming and data management. It was their experience with RAVE and their expertise in the area that helped make this project successful. A little background. Chimerix had been overseeing an investigator-initiated trial for several years. Being an investigator-initiated trial, the study had been built and released by the site using an Inform EDC as their database, as well as hosting the database on their server. After the decision was made by Chimerix to use the trial as part of our submission, the site informed us that they would no longer choose to host the database. And in fact, they gave us a transfer timeline of approximately 3 months. Obviously, this came as a shock to us, as we were heavily involved in several key deliverables with our submission. However, we knew we needed to act and act quickly. Our first thought was to have another vendor host the database. We reached out to several CROs that had previously hosted Inform trials. However, this option proved to be unviable due to many reasons. Primarily, the version of Inform that the site had built a study on was not the current version. And upgrading the study to the newest version as well as migrating the data would not meet our timelines. We also reached out directly to Oracle and Medidata to explore their migration options. However, again, these would not meet our timelines. This left us with the option of doing the rescue build and migration internally. We knew we had a RAVE URL that we could use, and we also had previous experience with a RAVE programming vendor that could accomplish this task under these strict timelines. Our director at Chimerix had worked previously with Amencefs and was very confident they could accomplish this. The decision to use Amencefs proved to be crucial as they needed to be both focused primarily on this objective as well as flexible. Again, the flexibility proved to be a key to success as there were many late nights and weekend meetings that occurred during the build. So let's talk a little about the study data that had to be moved to the new database. As I mentioned, the study was active for several years, with the first patient in being in January of 2016. There were now 86 subjects in the database. Of these 86 subjects, they had varying amounts of data, but being an oncology trial, there were several subjects that had more than 30 cycles of information, including lab. And there were now 5 sites that were active that would be impacted by this move. So how do we do this? The first step was choosing the right EDC programming vendor. We chose Amencefs as our EDC programming vendor to build this study, and I'll let Agbesi elaborate more on the design strategy.
Yeah, as we were made aware of the build, we were aware that we had to make the system easy to use for the sites in terms of functionality and what they were used to in Inform. So in addition to that, we also had to make sure that the data extract that came out of the RAVE EDC systems match as close as possible to the data extract from the Inform system to avoid more modification for the SAS team at Chimerix. And above all of that, we needed to go live in 4 weeks, and so that the data entry can begin and keep up with the timeline that Chimerix has set forth.
So let's summarize the challenges. Again, we're talking about 2 different EDC systems. The data was currently in the Inform EDC database, and now we're moving it to RAVE. So obviously these 2 EDC systems have different functionalities and outputs. As Agbesi mentioned, we had to keep in mind the variable names that were going to be used because there was expectations on the exports that they would match what was currently being programmed with the Inform outputs. And finally, things down to control types behave differently in the 2 systems. So we'll talk a little bit more of that in the next slide, but we had to take that into account during the design phase. Again, statistics was a key driver here. They had built their SAS programs already using the inform exports, and to reduce time and cost of SAS programming, we wanted the RAVE exports to match almost identically if possible. So data management had to oversee this build in 4 weeks. They next had to oversee the data migration portion, which is all the data coming over into the RAVE and being quality controlled in SDV. And finally, we had to take into account the site impact, making sure that the workflow was as close to inform as possible. So this is an example of the differences between the two systems. Inform allows you to do what I call nesting. They allow you to have a primary question with a certain response, and based off that response, have a sub-question nested beneath it, which would only be available if you answer the question above in a certain way. So as you can see here, box 1 for assay type has 2 responses. If you choose this certain response, you'll get box number 2, and so forth. This can go to several levels, and a lot of these questions had up to 4 levels of nesting. So RAVE does not do this. RAVE has 1 question per item. So we had to figure out a way to split these out to work in the same way that the Inform database worked in the CRFs for the sites, as well as be cognizant of the variable names at each step here. We also had other things like checkboxes, which I'll let Bessie elaborate on.
Yeah, in terms of checkboxes, the way the checkboxes were used in Inform or could be set up in Inform were different from how they're set up in RAVE. With Inform, they had the option to choose like coded values for the answer options. But in RAVE, checkboxes are always returning 1 or 0. So that wouldn't have worked for that kind of system to make sure that the output that comes out of the RAVE system matches what is come out from the Inform system in terms of data extract. So what we had to do is use these 1 item radio buttons to make sure that we could set the coded values for those checkbox items.
So let's look at the timeline we were facing. From the kickoff, we had 4 weeks to build the database and go live. This was needed because we had the data entry team ready to go to enter the 86 subjects. Once the database was live, the data entry team had approximately 6 weeks to enter all of the data of the 86 subjects and QC it. This included the SDV status and query statuses of each CRF. This was all so that we could push the study back out to regular study conduct.
So about the actual build, as Amencefs team was notified of this upcoming build, we started laying down the groundwork. So from the first conversation I had with Patty, the Director of Data Management at Chimerix, we started laying down the groundwork for the build. And we notify our programmers to stand by and be ready for this upcoming build that was going to be a fast build. And so we started doing the prep work, and we actually started building the forms on our sandbox URL using the annotated CRF and the materials that were provided to us initially before we got the full specifications for the study. And so we mobilized our programmers, and they were ready to start. And so we actually built most of the forms on our sandbox URL before we actually move the build to the actual URL, the Chimerix URL. And so for this build, we had to also do like rounds of field and form OID updates. And for that, we had to use the RAVE ALS upload because, as you know, in RAVE, once you set the OIDs, you cannot modify them in the system. So we had to actually do this by uploading. So we had to go through rounds of upload. And we want to acknowledge our lead EDC programmer here who, with his experience with ALS uploads and making updates using the ALS tool in RAVE, was very instrumental with this build and making these rounds of OID updates, which were necessary to make the output the data output that will come out of the system and match what it came out of the informed system in terms of data. And how did we do this? How were we able to do this in 4 weeks? So Reyes and I had regular working meetings, calls, and we became buddies during this process because we were having so many regular communications. Our team at Amencefs put in a lot of hours and was ready to put in extra hours if needed in order to make this happen. And so we also received, in terms of the data extract, to make sure that the data extracts match as much as possible, right? Couldn't match 100%, but to match as close as possible. We did text extract often and then had Reyes and their statistician at Chimerix review and provide us feedback in order to be able to do, another round of updates, coded value update or field update to make sure that things match. And we also want to acknowledge here the leadership of Patty and Reyes at Chimerix and the team at Chimerix for their work on this, and also the good work of our programming team and our data management team.
So once the enormous accomplishment of building the database in 4 weeks was finished, we still had the milestone of entering all the data. So Chimerix contracted with a vendor to perform data entry. The vendor team included 12 people, and most of them were data managers, which helped ensure quality and consistency of the data as they were entering it, because we needed to match the status of the data as well as the SDV status and query status. We had daily scrum huddles to check on the progress of the data entry with the data entry team, and they would report any issues of data entry and or the database. And finally, once all the data entry was completed, we did an additional QC audit of the entire process. So what have we learned? As everyone is aware in this industry, things happen. This was a rather surprise, but we knew that there's always a solution. So I think what I learned at Chimerix is that choosing the right team really pays off. We picked the right vendor in Amencefs that was flexible and focused. Our internal team knew that we had to get this done, and we did everything we could to meet the timeline. This involved a lot of creativity and hard work, as well as collaboration across vendors, across internal teams, and statistical and data management collaboration. Finally, I want to give acknowledgement to RAVE itself. The RAVE EDC was critical here because it proved to be robust to handle what we were trying to do to it, as well as adaptable and flexible. We didn't have any issues, and at the end of the day, that was crucial. And part of that RAVE EDC functionality is, as Bessie mentioned, is the ALS upload functionality. That was key here because several times we had to make sweeping changes across CRFs, and using the ALS to make these changes made it both consistent and quick. That concludes our presentation, and we look forward to hearing your questions at the live.